Welcome back to Beyond Campus, a podcast that delves into various topics pertaining to Israel, Zionism, and having a positive connection to Israel on campus and beyond. I'm your host, Destiny Albritton, with the Israel on Campus Coalition. This episode's special guest is David Bernstein. David is the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values and former executive director of the David Project. He is a prolific speaker, podcaster, and writer, having written hundreds of opinion pieces in the Jewish and general press. Thanks for joining us today. Enjoy the show. Thank you for being here today, David.
It's great to be with you. Thanks, Destiny.
Absolutely. Just to get started, I know you started the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. Could you tell me about what that organization is and why starting this was so important to you?
Sure. So I'm a lifer in the Jewish world. I actually started as a pro-Israel activist in Ohio State campus. I was head of the Student Forum for Israel, and I went to all the same, well, not all the same conferences. You guys have a lot more opportunities now than I did in my day, but I went to all the conferences, Hillel and APAC and what have you. And pretty early in my career, I started to notice an ideology was gaining ground in the discourse. There were people that were asserting that they had the answer. It used to be called political correctness, half jokingly maybe sometimes, but political correctness, and was later known colloquially at least as wokeness. But I started to feel that actually could be dangerous. I remember about 20 some years ago, I think this might have been in 1999, I was in this sort of multicultural day event where the speaker said that racism equals power plus prejudice plus power. And it struck me at that time that could be really dangerous for Jews, that Jews were perceived as being a powerful group, and that would mean that we couldn't really be victims of racism, and that groups that were perceived not to be powerful might not be able to be victimizers. And I just thought that was dangerous and that we should watch out for that. And I even wrote about it in the early 2000s. So I've been watching this for a while. But in the late, let's say around 2016, 2017, I started to really feel that the discourse was getting more and more shrill, was getting more and more ideological. It was becoming harder to talk about sensitive conversations and topics. And then, of course, we had the George Floyd moment. And like everyone else, I was very concerned about racism and policing and the like. And but I also became concerned that during this important racial reckoning we were having, we also were closing the discourse around important topics, and people were imposing views on others that where we needed to be discussing things, not just telling people what to think and how to think about specific topics. So I felt that was dangerous. And I started to really feel it in the work I was doing. You know, my understanding of America, a very imperfect country, constantly trying to live up to its own high ideals, is not that it is a racist country, but that it has a deep history of racism, and that there's still racism in this country. But it was not my narrative to think of America as being a pervasively racist country. And I felt increasingly that unless I repeated those words and saw America precisely that way, that I wasn't welcomed in certain progressive coalitions anymore. And that if I talked about Zionism or my support for Israel, I also could be at risk. And I felt that I could no longer work under those circumstances. So I left to start a new organization, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, to push back against that ideology, but also to try to open up the conversation.
Wow. You said something, really interesting I'd like to go back to, that the conversation around race and the way racism was being defined in these progressive circles was problematic for you because of the implications for what that could mean and how the Jewish community could be perceived because of those stereotypes of like the Jewish people being, powerful, etc. And I think so many people from beyond the Jewish community wouldn't hear that definition, that prejudice plus power, I think is how you put it, equals racism. And I think people wouldn't see that problem for the Jewish community because they don't understand Jewish identity and they don't understand anti-Semitism. Could you speak to, or could you explain, like, how would you define Jewish identity? Is being anti-Semitic racist?
Yeah, I know those are tough terms, and I think I think anti-Semitism can be a form of racism, but I figured even if it's not, even if we don't look at anti-Semitism as a form of racism, if the prevailing understanding of racism is that you have to have perceived to have power, then that we were going to be cut out of the conversation. What really started to get me were these like hierarchical pyramids of privilege and oppression and so forth, so that you could place person or an identity on this pyramid based on perceived power. So in other words, if you were white and male, you were at the very top of the pyramid. If you were black and female, you were somewhere, closer to the bottom, and you could add cis and trans and so forth. And I thought that that was really simplistic. Not that being a certain identity doesn't give you certain privilege or can't be a source of oppression under certain circumstances. It can be, of course, but it doesn't always act in that way. And having such a rigid view of race and racism and of power and privilege and so forth, I thought was going to inevitably lead, and I still think inevitably lead, to a kind of anti-Semitism, because Jewish identity then will be attached to the idea of privilege. Because Jews are perceived as white, and we could even go there. I think that in and of itself is problematic. But if whites are considered to be at the top of the privilege pyramid and Jews are considered white, Jews are then going to face demonization that is being often aimed at whites. And I don't think that's a healthy way of having the conversation. So you could start there. I just don't think that's the way we should be talking about race and racism. There are better ways and more thoughtful ways to talk about it. But I also think that the rigidity of that, the dogma in that, is inevitably going to lead to a kind of anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see what you're saying, and I've seen this on campus, that because race is defined in those terms, that or racism specifically are being defined in those terms that you're describing, anyone who isn't from a privileged group, their anti-Semitism doesn't count, is what a lot of the students that we've worked with at ICC experience, that
Yes.
since they are white or white passing, or whatever the terminology is, any discrimination against them or rhetoric that harms them doesn't count when it's from someone who comes from a less privileged background. But that obviously is problematic, and that just isn't how discrimination in every form works. And we know that, I think the FBI, like 2 years ago, they released or they discovered that 60%, nearly 60% of religiously motivated hate crimes in the United States are Jewish people. The victims are Jewish people. Why do you think that, with these statistics, why do you think that the Jewish community is still viewed as being privileged in the United States?
Yeah. See, unfortunately, the way that this ideology works, and we can come up with whatever term you want. I know the term woke has become very controversial. I don't
Sure.
need to use that term. People have used terms like critical social justice ideology, and I think it's fine. People don't know what it is, so I tend to go back to woke, because at least you have some idea of what I'm talking about. So the problem is, in this ideology, people conflate success with privilege and power. So if you're a group that succeeds on average above the mean, you're likely to be perceived as being a powerful group. And I just don't think there's any easy way around that. That's just how the ideology sort of structures the world. And that's why I think we have to ultimately sort of reject the rigidity of the ideology itself. Like, there's an impulse in the Jewish community, and I've had this impulse, so it's not like I'm making this up or blaming others for it, to try to compete for victim status. As some people would say, play the victim Olympics, and I think we shouldn't try to do that. I think that we reinforce the rigidity of the ideology when we suggest that we actually are victims, and you should treat us like victims, and then give us a privileged status based in the conversation based on our victimhood. I just don't think that's the way forward. It's not a sophisticated and thoughtful way to look at the world. It's very rigid. It's very dogmatic. We can talk about racism and anti-Semitism and hate that still exists in our society, but leave the conversation open enough for people to have alternative points of view about it. I think that's a much healthier way forward than getting stuck into this sort of ideological morass. So I tend to reject the terms and not try to get Jews to be viewed as one of the protected classes within it.
Hmm. Hmm. Could you mentioned that you've been, involved in, or like you yourself are like liberal and progressive. How do those values connect to Judaism or your Jewish values?
Yeah. So I would say as a sort of a traditional Jewish liberal, somebody who believes that, the world is often unfair. I don't always know why it's unfair. I can't necessarily identify every cause. I have theories, but they're just theories. But I know that some people have more than others, and I want to even the playing field as much as possible. But I also know that if you go too far in that direction, you might actually create a less just society, even if that's not what you intend to do. The world doesn't always work the way we think it should. So that's what it means to me to be a Jew and a liberal. I think there is an impulse in Judaism to repair the world. The idea of tikkun olam comes from an authentic Jewish historical and consciousness that we want to make the world a better place. I think that really is part of who we are. But that doesn't mean that we have to adhere to a very rigid ideological format in how we do that. So when I fight for criminal justice reform, because I don't believe we should have 2 million people incarcerated, I'm doing so because I believe that America can do better than that. When I believe in immigrant rights because I believe America is a country of immigrants, and that we want to make sure that immigrants continue to come to this country. But that doesn't mean that those topics are beyond debate. In other words, there might be people who have legitimate points of view who say, wait a second, we have too many immigrants coming into this country right now, and that's creating a backlash. And I have to be able to hear that as an immigrant rights activist. I can't shut down the conversation. And I might, and there are people who might say, yes, look, we have too many people incarcerated, but if we become too lax in our prosecution of offenders, the communities that are most vulnerable to crime are the ones who are going to pay the price. And we see this over and over. I mean, if you look at the statistics, the Black and American community is the most concerned about the crime rate of any other community in the United States. So it's not fair to say, well, abolish the police or defund the police. I mean, that the community that you're supposedly doing that on who you're advocating for doesn't want that largely. So those are the kinds of things that we have to bring into the conversation if we're honest and we're open. And I do believe that Judaism also requires us to be honest and open. One of my favorite phrases is machloket l'shem shamayim. That's arguments for the sake of heaven. We talk a lot about the houses of Hillel and the houses of Shammai, and they were both houses that wrote and competed for writing Jewish law. And the great tale is that God sided with the house of Hillel over the house of Shammai. Why? Because the house of Hillel not only cited its own arguments for why the Jewish law should be the way it was, the way that they recommended, but it also cited first Shammai's reasons. So that shows you the value we place in what sometimes you might call steel manning the other side. We have to be able to have these conversations. And in a society where you can't have those conversations, in a society that tries to shut down the discourse, that tries to cancel people who have different points of view, that doesn't want dissent on any of these issues, is not a society where Jews are going to do well in either. Jews do well in what I call liberal societies, open societies, societies where people can express a multiplicity of points of view. So it's for those reasons, through both my Jewish values and my Jewish experience, that I think the Jewish community sort of has to push back against these trends.
Mm-hmm. What would you say to a student, a Zionist student activist who is facing a situation where one of these progressive causes is being co-opted by the Palestinian, nationalist activists on their campus? Like specifically, we have seen when there's a conversation about police brutality in this country, like you've mentioned, we often see like those movements get co-opted by statements like from Ferguson to Palestine. How would you advise a student activist who wants to show up in those spaces, combating and advocating against police brutality, for example, while still being, a strong, passionate Zionist, but pushing back on the rhetoric that, is being co-opted by unrelated causes or causes that are just so different from what we're talking about here in the United States? How would you respond to that?
Sure. So the first thing I tell people is be proud Jews. Don't sell yourself out. Don't sell your people out. Start with Jewish pride, and let that guide you. Let your own values and principles guide you. So if you find that you can influence those people by saying, I'm Jewish and I believe in this, and you should hear my view and not try to shut me out, and you can influence people, then obviously give it a shot. And try it. But if you can't, then create your own coalition. I mean, then find your own friends. I mean, you're not going to be making the world a more just place if you join a coalition that won't have you to be part of it, that won't allow you to be your full self in that coalition. They're probably not doing the good that they think. And sometimes I find that coalitions that get so obsessed over everybody's views and they impose litmus tests and everything else, they actually don't get a lot of work done. They actually end up embroiled in these long conversations about who gets to have standing and who's oppressed and who's not, and they don't actually go and fight for criminal justice reform or fight against, police brutality. So I would find some new friends if that's the case.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's something that we say at ICC is you have to have a consensus when you are building a coalition. And if you're not all aligned on whatever that consensus is, you won't get anything done.
You won't. Absolutely. And so I know, believe me, I'm very familiar with that circumstance, both as a former campus activist, as the head of an organization that worked with pro-Israel students on campus, and as a Jewish professional who's worked on coalitions outside of the campus. Everything that you see on campus is like we see elsewhere. I say campus is like everywhere else, but more so. And right, so I've been in coalitions that wanted me to renounce or give up something of myself to be part of them. The great Israeli thinker Einat Wilf calls it giving up a pound of flesh. Yes. They're demanding that you give up a pound of flesh. And I don't think we should give up our pound of flesh. And if they insist that we do so, we should decline to be part of that group.
Absolutely. And often it doesn't stop there. Whatever they're asking you to compromise on for that initial entry, it won't stop there.
Right. It won't. And it's because the underlying operating system is sick. It's the underlying operating system should be, let's bring together people who are different than we are so we can fight for a common cause. That's what it should be. If the operating system is, we have all the answers, and if you're not part of this definition of who has power and who has privilege and who has oppression and who's right in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the operating system itself that animates that is sick. And I don't think we should be part of that. That's why I say liberalism, and by liberalism I don't mean left wing, is the fundamental operating system of a democratic society. It's the idea that we can talk and debate with each other. We can disagree agreeably, Sometimes we can even disagree disagreeably, but we still fundamentally respect the fact that other people are going to have opinions that differ from our own, and we have to live with them, find ways of living with them. That's the operating system. That's what allows us to live semi-peacefully most of the time and vote and come up with an agreed upon choice for president or whatever other offices. Once that operating system itself becomes corrupt, whether it's coming from the right, and sometimes it's coming from the far right, or if it's coming from the far left, our democratic values are in danger. And I think we have to push back against that, not take part in operating systems that are leading us in a direction that compromises our democratic values.
You wrote a book, Woke Anti-Semitism. Can you unpack that title for us?
Sure. So first, what do I mean by woke? I mean two things. And again, if you want to use a different word, we can use a different word. It's a little provocative, and I wanted people to be provoked into reading the book. But if you want to then substitute it for something else, fine. I'm not stuck on the word. Woke. I mean two things. One is that racism and prejudice and bias are not just a matter of personal opinion or outlook, but they're embedded in the very structures and systems of society. That's number one. Number two, that only people with lived experience of that oppression are qualified to define it for the rest of society. Now, both of those things can be true. It can be true that racism and oppression are actually encoded in society itself, that it's in the air that we breathe in some circumstances. I think in Jim Crow America, racism was absolutely embedded and ingrained in the very foundations of our society at that time. I think you could say the same about anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany, even before the final solution began. So yes, of course that can be true. It can also be true, by the way, that people with lived experience have something to say. So as a Jew who's experienced a lot of anti-Semitism growing up, maybe society should at least hear me out on my experience. But both of those things are not always true. It's not always true that racism is embedded in every nook and cranny of society. And it's also not always true that my lived experience gives me an unqualified ability to define oppression to everybody else. First of all, there were other Jews who might disagree with me about anti-Semitism. Let's start there. It's not like we all agree on what anti-Semitism is and how it shows up and everything. And the other thing is there might be other data points that you might want to hear besides my lived experience. Maybe there's a survey and there is, by the way, that shows that American Jews are the most admired religious community in the United States. So I have to be able to hear that data point as well as lived experience. So what that wokeness does, that idea that only I get to define the world for you because of my oppression, and then I'm going to then define a very hierarchical understanding of how oppression and privilege work, and you have to then defer to that because I have standing to define that for you. I think that's where gets us off track. And it's not like all the people who are saying that are bad people or don't mean well. I think many of them mean very well. They're trying to make America live up to its own ideals, but they're creating a system that's really, really stifling and dogmatic. And when you have a system like that, where you insist that everybody really has to agree with your point of view on something, you're making it so others don't have a point of view that's able to be expressed, and you're also empowering certain voices that might be anti-Semitic. And I think that's where, you're saying that, well, if you're saying, like we said before, that if you don't have power, you're not perceived to have power, that you can't be racist, then maybe if you're of that same group, then you can't be anti-Semitic either. And so therefore, no one's willing to criticize anti-Semitism if it comes from certain quarters. And I think that can't be the case. That can't be the case. Just like, anybody can be racist, anybody can be anti-Semitic. Mm-hmm. So I think that's and I think there's several foundations where anti-Semitism comes alive. If you insist, for example, that Ashkenazic Jews are white, And Ashkenazic Jews not all might not identify as being white because of their experience as Jews. And you're saying that that has to be your self characterization. I think that's a kind of erasure. It's a way of saying that your Jewish identity has no standing. That we're going to insist, we're going to tell you exactly who you are and how you fit into society. I personally come from a mom who's from Baghdad, Iraq. I'm more than 50% Western Asian, according to 23andMe. And I've never really viewed myself as white, and I don't particularly like the category anyway. And what's more, when I hear people sort of demonizing whiteness, and you hear this a lot, I think, boy, that sounds an awful lot like anti-Semitism, even if it's just aimed at white people. That the demonization itself I find problematic. And so I think Jews should be very wary of ideologues who tell us who we are, what racial classification we have to adopt ourselves, and then demonize other people, no matter who the target of their demonization is.
Mm-hmm. How would you distinguish between this woke anti-Semitism and far-right anti-Semitism? Something that's been happening on college campuses, particularly in the Southeast. There's been this group called Yay is Right that is traveling throughout the Southeast, going to different schools and talking about how Kanye West is right about the Jews. And in this case, it's you've got these, probably white supremacists, right? I'm not so familiar with the group, but probably white supremacists are like along that ideology, saying that this Black celebrity is right about the Jewish people. How is that different from, how's that distinct from like woke anti-Semitism? And, while we're on this subject, what are your thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, so I think very good question. That anything I say about woke anti-Semitism should not be taken to minimize anti-Semitism that comes from other quarters. Jonathan Greenblatt, who's the head of the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, says that anti-Semitism on the right is like a hurricane, and anti-Semitism on the left is like climate change. It's slower moving, and I think corrosive, and I think that that's true, generally speaking. Although I would add that we're very open about talking about the ideological underpinnings of anti-Semitism on the right, but we tend not to want to talk about the CO2 emissions on the left that are producing the climate change. So, for example, when we talk about anti-Semitism, the hurricane on the right, we tend to talk about the Great Replacement theory. The idea that immigrants are coming into this country and replacing ordinary Americans. And that's what we heard at Charlottesville, for example. That does cause a kind of anti-Semitism because Jews are perceived as the group that's bringing in all those immigrants to replace ordinary Americans. So that is the ideological underpinning, or one of them, of anti-Semitism on the right. I think that there are variants that you see coming from different quarters of society. There's the variant that comes from Black Hebrews, that Jews stole the authentic covenant of Black people. And then you hear, of course, the Nation of Islam and others repeat that. What you hear from the Kanye West crowd tends to mimic right-wing anti-Semitism and the white nationalist variety of anti-Semitism. It tends to be conspiratorial in nature, which is what anti-Semitism really is. It's a kind of conspiracy theory that tends to be embedded in larger conspiracy theories. So that views Jews as controlling the banking industry, or Jews controlling, the media or Hollywood or whatever else. And so that's what they're going around and saying. I don't want to say anything to minimize that. That's a real threat. And it tends to be the case that people on the right have guns. And so, when we spend money defending your Hillel and at a security guard during high holiday service or whatever, that's because we're mostly scared about anti-Semitism on the right. Also, of course, we're worried about anti-Semitism, a variant that comes from the Muslim world, which views Jews as the infidel and gives radicals the permission to, attach suicide belts to them and blow up communities and people and so forth. That's another ideology that gives rise to a form of anti-Semitism. But that doesn't mean anti-Semitism on the left is not a threat. it's a more corrosive, slower moving thread. It disenfranchises Jews from politics. It seeks to treat Jews as the other and not worthy of being part of society. So it doesn't try to shoot you usually, but it does try to shoot you down.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction, but also equally concerning and problematic. Um, and I don't like it, but the explanation from Jonathan Greenblatt, I think is an interesting perspective.
Yes. Someone else once said that, right wing extremism is like a heart attack and left wing extremism is like a cancer. I think that's also another metaphor you can use to understand it. And again, it doesn't mean, I may be more afraid of the right wing extremism, to be honest with you, I am, than I am left wing extremism. But in some ways, I worry that left wing extremism just empowers the right. So if you insist, for example, that automatically someone's whiteness gives them privilege. Imagine what it's like to be living in a really, really poor area where former manufacturing town, there's no jobs. Not only don't you have a job, but maybe your dad didn't even have a job. It's been going on so long. It's opioid addiction runs rampant through that town, and you're told that you have privilege, you can imagine how that's going to create a kind of identitarianism on the right that's going to even lead to more extremism. So some of my concerns about wokeness are really that we're going to be fanning the flames of radicalism and illiberalism and anti-Semitism on the right as well. And I just don't think it's the way you have a conversation in society.
Mm-hmm. How would you say that woke progressivism differs from traditional liberal values?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when I grew up, being a liberal meant that I wanted to help people who I saw as having disadvantages, no matter what the reasons for those were. I didn't have some grand theory as to why certain people had power and why other people didn't. I just felt we had an obligation to help the more needy in our society. And that's still who I am today and what I believe today. Wokeism says I not only are, of course, are there haves and have-nots, but the haves cause the conditions of the have-nots, and so therefore we have to go after the haves, and we're going to tell you exactly who the haves are by virtue of their identities. So I think that's how it differs, and that hasn't always been the case. That liberals define themselves in such ideological terms. Liberals haven't traditionally in America had that grand explanation for why there are differences and why there are problems. To me, that's the most important distinction. And I think I think the kind of liberalism that I grew up with is more suited to problem solving in society. Like I want to lift people up who have come from disadvantaged places. I want to make sure that they have every opportunity, but I'm flexible in my outlook. So, for example, if you buy the sort of woke notion, maybe Abraham X. Kendi anti-racist notion, that the only reason for some groups doing better than others is that the groups that are not doing as well are being actively discriminated against, and so therefore, in order to end that, as Kendi would argue, you have to immediately get to their proportionate representation in society. So, for example, if there's only, I don't know if this is true, 3% Black scientists, but there are 13% Black Americans, you must hire 13% Black scientists. And what I think that gets wrong is that it doesn't invest in people in their early years. Like I want to say, yes, I'd like to see more parity in the numbers of people from disadvantaged groups. But I don't think you can do that by just hiring in the here and now that way. What you have to do is create much better education. You must invest in young people. You must create programs that help them become scientists, that give them interest in science. And I think that is more likely in the long run to actually kind of create the equity that Kendi and others say that they want. If you try to do it in the here and now, you're actually not going to create a more equitable society. So that's one of the key differences between this progressive wokeism and traditional liberal values.
So my last question for you. We've spoken about some pretty big topics in a very short amount.
Yes, we have.
Of time, from climate change to raging hurricanes, figuratively speaking. What gives you hope for the future of the Jewish community and the future of Jewish liberal values?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think most people in general, and young people are actually quite open-minded. I have my oldest son is 26 years old. My youngest is 18. I have an 18-year-old stepson and a 20-year-old stepdaughter. And I actually find that people don't tend to buy into either radical ideologies on the right or the left. That they're quite actually willing to have the discussion. Now, if they feel like somebody hyper woke comes into the room, they all get quiet and pretend that either pretend to agree with them or just shut up and don't say what they really think because they don't want an argument. And I think that's a problem, by the way. I really do. I think that what's required is more young, thoughtful people in the Jewish community, outside the Jewish community, who are moderate to share their moderate views when things get heated. When you abandon the field to the most shrill voices, you're not pouring fuel. You're not making a world a better place. You're actually abandoning it to the radicals. Mm-hmm. And so what gives me hope is the fact that there's a lot of really young, smart, young, thoughtful people who have great critical thinking skills and just haven't always spoken up yet. So people like me want to get you all to take some risks and say, listen, I know the world's not a perfect place. I know America is far from perfect, but let's not overstate it here. And here's what I think. And even if that gets you in hot water for a minute, I think if enough people do that, there's strength in numbers. And if you come with a few of your friends and you stand up for that openness, those liberal values, and you also, of course, stand up for Jews in Israel, we will very rapidly shift these dynamics. So that gives me a lot of hope, and I'm already seeing it. And the very fact that you're willing to have me on this podcast, I actually shouldn't be controversial because I'm actually quite a mainstream human. But the fact that you're willing to have me shows that you're willing to take risks to open up this conversation. I think that's really super important, and it's been great having this conversation with you, Destiny.
Absolutely. I agree. We have to amplify more reasonable voices because, like you said, there are people with less reasonable positions that are speaking very loudly right now. And it's so important for reasonable voices to speak up and be amplified right now. Thank you so much for joining us today, David Bernstein.
Thank you so much, Destiny. And thank you, ICC.
Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to follow us on social media @IsraelCC and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.